So we arrive at the topic of pain. No one likes it, and we sure wish it wasn't such a big part of our lives. Pain is something that unites the entire human race together because we all have to go through it. And it can take its shape in different ways for different people. For instance, people can experience emotional pain from losing a cherished loved one. Someone whose life was so deeply connected to our lives that life without that person doesn't seem much like life at all. And then there's physical pain, where you may be someone who has something like fibromyalgia, where you would experience body-wide pain in tender points and joints, muscles, tendons, and other soft tissues for a very long period of time, or even for the rest of your life in this world. And as if that weren't enough, we can go through spiritual pain, where we can cry out in confusion with words like, "Why, God, did you allow this to happen to me?" And in these circumstances, where the spiritual pain is something along the lines of having confused feelings or unanswered questions that keep you up at night, and perhaps even a feeling of abandonment by your God, is also combined with your physical pain or emotional pain or even both. Well, that's very sad, but the fact of the matter is, pain is a part of life. Ever since the fall of man and the curse of creation, brought on by the first man, Adam's disobedience to God's single command in the garden. As Romans chapter 8, verse 20 puts it, the creature was made subject to vanity. Vanity here means futility. And then skipping down to verse 23, it says, and not only they, the creation, but ourselves also. And so this act of disobedience against a holy God by the first man Adam, the progenitor of the entire human race, was a sin. And now his sinful nature has been passed down to all of us. And thus, we're all sinners. Now, our topic is pain, but the Bible says, for the wages of sin is death. Romans 6:23. So not only did the fall bring about pain and suffering, but also death is required to satisfy this just sentence, which God promised would happen if he was disobeyed. Speaking to Adam, God said, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." Genesis 2:17. And so jumping back to the New Testament, Romans chapter 5, verse 12, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. And so this all sounds pretty bleak, and we can see the effects of this judgment and condemnation in our lives all the time. For instance, why is childbirth so painful for women? It was part of the judgment for the original sin in the garden of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The first time the word pain is used in the Bible is when God says to Eve, that's Adam's helpmeet and spouse, God said, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children." Genesis 3:16. Oh, but a momentary side note. Aren't new little babies just such a blessing? Scripture says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward." Psalm 127:3. If we know during painful trials, such as childbirth, and I know I've watched my wife do it, but that God is behind it all, working in us to make something good, then the following words in Scripture make sense to us. "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance." Well, everything that I've said before this point was recorded a few weeks before now in a theological study of pain in order to help those who are looking for answers. But you see, today, I'm no longer approaching this message from a theological vantage point. although there still may be some theological principles in this testimony. And I pray there is. But today, it's personal. You see, about a week ago, my wife and I learned that the 10-week-old baby that she was carrying within her womb had passed away. And knowing that the baby had died inside of her, my wife and I decided that it would be better for her to carry the child until things naturally happened, instead of going ahead with a DNC. Now, of course, I'm not condemning a DNC in an occasion like this, but believe it or not, one blessing was my wife delivered the child at home and was able to recover the fetus. And let me just say, tiny little fingers, tiny little toes, ears, eyes, nose, and mouth were obviously visible at 10 weeks. But if she had had the DNC, we would not have had the body to have a proper burial, which was above anything else for our sakes and our consolation. I had just spoken to a dear friend over this weekend who said that he and his wife didn't have the consolation of a proper burial because of the procedure at the hospital, where they consider what's in the woman tissue and medical waste. Now, as I said before, my wife and I consider it a blessing that she was able to have the baby at home because we had the body for the burial. But the doctors would disagree. Why? Because after she had the baby, she hemorrhaged, which is to say she never stopped bleeding. She bled and bled and bled some more. She wound up bleeding so much that she knew it was time to go to the emergency room because she almost passed out at least 4 times. So St. Jackie, my wife's wonderful mother, who was there during the whole ordeal, took my wife to the emergency room. The doctors said that they couldn't believe that my wife walked in conscious because she had lost so much blood. I arrived at the hospital shortly after she got there. Turns out they still needed to do an emergency DNC as well as give her 2 units worth of a blood transfusion. Now, she was a bit nervous about being put under for the operation and being alone without her family. Without her family because we weren't allowed in the operating room with her, and we were ordered to stay in a waiting room during the procedure. But she realized that God was with her, and she held this psalm close to her mind and her heart.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Now that was my wonderful wife that quoted that passage to you, but that was the passage on which she was reflecting in her time of trouble. And bless God for giving us, his children, riches, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge through his word to call upon in our time of need and distress. His very voice speaking into our ear, into our minds, our hearts, and our souls. Like Psalm 119, verse 11 says, Thy word have I hid in mine heart. And his word gives us assurance that even though my wife was considering her own mortality just before this procedure, she knew that her God would not forsake her or leave her, but was with her. And since she knows that God said it, that settled it for her, and it should settle it for every other living human being. I quite frankly don't know how people who don't know Jesus get by in situations like these. I assume they suppose that their Dagons who fall over into pieces can comfort them, save them, rescue them, be there for them, calm them in the midst of a storm, and in their time of dying, have his angels escort them into Abraham's bosom. But what foolishness that is, and such a great waste. Those things can only be done by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that's the God in whom we serve.